Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Thanks for Sharing. I am your host, Jackie Pack, and today I am recording an episode that I had put out to my Patreon page asking for feedback. Hey, I'm thinking of doing a podcast episode. Which ones would you, what out of, I think I gave a couple of options and said, which one would you like to hear? And this episode was the one requested. So here we go. Now, I know that this topic may be one that people listening have experienced personally or heard about in conversations or observed in a friend's relationship, but you may not have heard the terminology that we use in our field to describe this dynamic. So I wanted to talk about the concept of trauma bonding. A couple of things when I was thinking about recording this episode, I was thinking through different questions that I've had clients where we are talking about trauma bonding in their life and they're seeing the examples of that, of trauma bonding. Some of the questions that they have asked me, I was trying to remember those so that I can cover that, as well as possible questions that you would have as you're listening to this episode. If you've seen this concept of trauma bonding in social media posts or articles, I think sometimes it's often connected to narcissistic relationships and abusive dynamics, which I'm not saying that's wrong. It's not necessarily capturing the whole concept. We can't just say, oh, people in relationships with narcissists are trauma bonded. Possibly. But this is something I say a lot. Narcissism is a complex diagnosis and takes time to actually narrow down. People can have narcissistic traits and not be a narcissist. So me, along with other mental health professionals, I think get concerned when we start seeing diagnostic terms that are complex getting thrown so easily around in the general population. So I'll talk specifically about, does this happen in narcissistic relationships or not? To start this episode, I want to talk about what trauma bonding actually means, where the concept comes from, and why it's so powerful. Some of the questions I get are, is it always happening in extremes? Or can it show up dramatically and quietly or more passively? Why it's so often misunderstood, and most importantly, what healing and freedom from these destructive bonds looks like. Dr. Patrick Carnes, who many of my listeners know from his work around sex addiction and betrayal trauma, really popularized this idea through his book, The Betrayal Bond, which came out in 1997. I think it was 2 years ago, the book which came out in 1997. There has been a second edition of the book that came out more recently. A couple of years ago, he was doing an online training talking about this book. I think it was either the anniversary of the book or the anniversary of, or it was when the second edition came out. Actually, that's not going to work. From something in 1997 happening in 2022. That doesn't math. So I don't really recall why he decided to do it, but there was something significant about the book. So maybe the second edition was out, or I don't really remember. But I did sign up for this online workshop and it was great. It was a very informative training, listening to him talk about his thinking on this and diving specifically into the book, which an author writes is always, I think, interesting to listen to. But Patrick Carnes didn't coin the term betrayal bond. The term was actually used earlier in the 1980s by psychologist Donald Dutton and criminologist Susan Painter in their work on domestic violence and the cycle of violence that they created. The idea of trauma repetition, also sometimes we call repetition compulsion, originated from Freud. And it overlaps. It describes how people unconsciously repeat traumatic patterns in relationships and situations. Trauma bonding would be one form of trauma repetition, and it's the relational attachment expression of this compulsion. Patrick Carnes, however, used the term trauma bond to describe the unhealthy attachment that's formed in relationships of abuse, betrayal, or exploitation, where intermittent reinforcement of reward and punishment deepens the bond. Carnes gave it language and context in recovery circles And his examples help bring it to life. So if we start with a definition, a trauma bond is an emotional attachment to someone who is destructive, exploitive, or harmful, but where the victim feels an almost compulsive pull to stay connected. So we can't just say bad relationships have trauma bonds. Trauma bonds have a particular structure. Cycles of harm, betrayal, or neglect that are interrupted by moments of kindness, affection, or hope. This intermittent reinforcement is what wires the nervous system to cling tighter instead of letting go and walking away. This is similar to some of the research that was done in gambling addiction, where that intermittent reinforcement is a particularly strong bond. The I almost got there keeps people engaged longer than they intended to. I got close enough, maybe the next time. I will explain it as when we have these intermittent cycles of positive praise, connection that lead to some hope. For the victim, there's a feeling of, this is why I'm here. This is who I know this person to be. If we can only keep this going longer. But the cycle will then move into the betrayal, the destructiveness, the harmfulness. In his book, The Betrayal Bond, Patrick Carnes uses the example of Patty Hearst. Depending on how old you are, some of you may remember this story. Some of you may not. Some of you may not have even heard of it. So let me summarize it. And I will say the podcast Morbid did an episode, I think it was a 2-part episode, maybe a month ago, about Patty Hearst. And they go into the details of this that I'm not going to go into because this is not a true crime podcast, but I will give a summary. If you want to refresh your memory of the story, or if you haven't heard the story and you want to hear the details, I would recommend heading over to the Morbid podcast. And like I said, it's maybe 3-4 weeks ago that podcast came out. So go check it out for more information. But to sum up this story, 1974, Patty Hearst was the granddaughter of publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst. And she was living away in California, going to college. She was living with a boyfriend. She was kidnapped by a radical group called the Symbionese Liberation Army. For weeks, she was terrorized, isolated, blindfolded, and abused. And the kidnappers, meantime, are making all these demands on her family, knowing that they had a lot of money and power. And the family was cooperating. They were doing what they could to get their daughter back. But something shocking happened. Patty started cooperating with her captors. She started believing in their cause. And she even participated in a bank robbery with them and made it clear that it was her, Patty Hearst. From the outside, it looked incomprehensible. How could a victim join forces with her captors and abusers? But when you look at it through the lens of trauma bonding, it starts to make sense. There was a detail, I'll just give you this piece. Shortly after being kidnapped, they're driving away, she's blindfolded, and one of her captors reaches out and holds her hand. And this was significant in starting a trauma bond with her captors. Her survival brain attached to the only people who had power over her. And the cycle of abuse and intermittent kindness wired attachment in a way that was stronger than reason. Now, most of us won't go through something that extreme, but the dynamics don't have to be that extreme. Whether it's an abusive partner, a toxic workplace, or even certain family dynamics. Trauma bonds form when harm and betrayal are fused with hope and moments of connection. And again, when we think of gambling addiction and the research that was done on that, it's this, I almost am there. It's just, it feels like it's within my reach if I just stay a little bit longer, keep going a little bit longer. So let's talk about why we fall into these bonds. First, because trauma repetition, or what Sigmund Freud called repetition compulsion, is part of human psychology. We repeat what is familiar, even when it's painful. This past week, there were a handful of sessions that I'm talking with my clients, and I will say to them, if we are born in secure enough family systems, that gift just keeps on giving. And likewise, if we're born into insecure, dysfunctional family systems, that gift also just keeps on giving. And it's not fair, but it happens. And it is because of this repeating what is familiar, even if it's painful. It's like this unconscious attempt to master an old wound by replaying it, hoping this time for a different outcome. So I'll say this happens sometimes subconsciously. People can think that they're picking a partner who is different than this dynamic that they know so well. And it might be slightly different. Sometimes I'm like, yeah, they look different than their parents. They initially act different than the parents or their previous relationship. And I think our brain, sometimes I will say, this is how I'll explain it. Our brain doesn't really know how to make sense of trauma, doesn't know how to make meaning of trauma. It's kind of like a puzzle that the brain can't quite solve, can't make sense of. And so it looks for similar patterns or parallel enough patterns and thinks, oh, that's a similar puzzle. Maybe moving towards that, we can kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. If this situation, which is parallel or similar to the situation we grow up in, maybe if we have a different outcome in this one, we finally solve for why, or we solve this problem, then it'll also work backwards and solve the pain of the family system I grew up in. Dr. Carnes uses another example here in his book, Lucy and Charlie Brown in the Peanuts cartoon. So think about it. It's this time of year. Every year in the fall, Lucy tells Charlie Brown that she's going to hold the football steady so that he can kick it. And Charlie Brown has been here, done that before. And he says, no, you're going to, right as I get up to kick it, you're going to pull it away. And she promises, no, I won't. Yet every year she yanks it away at the last second. And he ends up flat on his back. Charlie Brown knows what's going to happen, but he keeps trying anyway. He keeps believing her. What she says in that moment doesn't line up with his reason or his logical thinking of the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And he hopes that this time will be different. That's trauma repetition in a nutshell. Many of us go back to people who have let us down or betrayed us, convinced by their promises or by our own hope that this time it will be different. And like Charlie Brown, we end up hurt all over again. Why do we do this? As I've been saying, often the roots are in our childhood. When we grow up, when a child grows up with inconsistent caregiving, maybe this is a parent who withholds affection, can be critical, but alternates between warmth and neglect or warmth and criticism. That pattern becomes wired as normal. And as adults, we unconsciously seek it out. It feels familiar, even if in reality it's destructive. Shame also plays a role in the dynamic. Shame also plays a role in this dynamic. We often internalize the belief that we are the problem. It's my fault. I will often tell clients, sometimes they ask me, well, why would we do that as a kid? Why would I blame myself? And I will say, well, if we have this sense of dependency on these people, and I'll say, think about it for a minute. For this child, the world is big, it's noisy, it's loud, it's fast. It doesn't make sense. It's scary. And so we need people who we believe are going to keep us safe. Even if the people we are dependent on or we have in our life aren't actually going to keep us safe. But that can also, if we knew that these people who I'm dependent on are not safe or actually are harmful to me, that can be damaging to the developing psyche of the child. So in essence, internalizing this belief that something's wrong with me feels like it protects the people who we cannot depend on so that we're not aware of that dangerousness with them. It also tells us that if I'm the problem, maybe I can just try harder. I can be better, or I can hang on long enough and I'll finally get it right, which feels like that child has some ability to control this dynamic. And that's a very powerful trap that deepens the bond, the trauma bond. Now, some of you might be thinking, okay, I see this in extreme abuse stories. And we do. You know, you can read stories about a child who's taken out of the home and put into foster care. And the details are horrific. The abuse that that child has suffered at the hands of their parents or a step parent. And I don't know if this is available to the public or if these are things that therapists read. I don't know. But sometimes you'll hear that the child who's taken away from the family is saying, well, it's not really their fault. If I would have just done this, if I would have just made my bed that morning, this wouldn't have happened. Logically, to any rational adult, we know that's not true, but that is that dynamic that's happening. The child is trying to blame them and not the caretaker that they are dependent on. So yes, we see this in abuse stories, extreme abuse stories. But what about more subtle situations? Can trauma bonding happen passively in quieter ways that don't feel so obvious? Well, absolutely. Trauma bonds are not always loud and violent. They can look like a partner who constantly dismisses your needs, but occasionally shows affection. It can be a boss who criticizes you constantly, but praises you just enough to keep you trying. Or a friend who excludes you often, but when they need something, they shower you with attention. These passive situations, they're not going to make headlines. But our nervous system doesn't care about headlines. It cares about patterns. And if the pattern is harm or neglect, interrupted by intermittent reward, the bond will still be created. Like anything that's happening with neglect or that is not as obvious, they are harder to identify because people minimize them. Yeah, sure, the person who it's happening to, but sometimes also the onlookers or the ones who are hearing about it. It doesn't stand out. So they say, well, everybody has a bad day, or it's not that bad. At least it's not physically abusive, but that's not what matters. The cycle is the same, and it will leave people feeling stuck, depleted, but still hooked. So another question I hear a lot is, so is trauma bonding just what happens in a narcissistic relationship? While it's true that someone with narcissistic traits can create trauma bonds, the cycle of devaluation and intermittent idealization is a classic setup. But it's not limited to that. Trauma bonding isn't about a diagnosis. It's more about a pattern. You can have a trauma bond with someone who isn't clinically narcissistic at all, but who is inconsistent or neglectful. You can have it with a parent, a boss, a religious leader, or even a system or organization. And here's why I think that matters. If we reduce trauma bonding to narcissism, we risk missing all the other ways it shows up. People may think, well, my partner isn't a narcissist, so I guess this isn't trauma bonding. Or people might demonize this other person with this label of narcissism, focusing on that instead of the actual pattern that needs healing. So I don't think the useful question is this person a narcissist? The more useful question is, am I confusing intensity with intimacy? Am I bonded to this person through cycles of harm and repair? Now, that may lead to another question for people listening to my podcast and different episodes where I talk about sex addiction recovery, or we talk about betrayal trauma recovery. And you may be asking, okay, so if I was harmed, why are you as the therapist or as the CSAT now telling me that I should hope that my partner can repair? And that's a valid question. So if I was asked that question, I would say, well, some people can change. And while there might be cycles of harm and repair that are involved in sex addiction and betrayal trauma, addiction is a treatable condition, as is betrayal trauma. And so I will tell them, I don't know. I don't know up front if people can improve the cycle that they're in, that they're coming to me for, which is sex addiction and betrayal trauma. I don't know if people won't do that, if they just won't do the work. It takes time to know that, because I don't know that I've had a client, think for a quick moment, I don't know that I've had a client who comes to therapy, which is where I would see them, who says, no, I don't want it. I don't want to change. I came here. I told my wife I would come here. I told my spouse I would come here. I told them I wanted to change, but actually I'm not going to do that. I've had clients where they say they want to come and they want to get better. And maybe in our sessions, they do some good work. But outside of our session, nothing's changing. In fact, they're just continuing in the destructive behavior. And I have had clients where I say, look, therapy is not just a place that you come to for an hour or two a week. Therapy is a place that you come to and you get direction and you try to implement that the rest of the week. Therapy is just 1 hour of a week. So if you're only counting on what happens in this 1 hour to fix things, it's not going to happen. You have to act on what's talked about in a therapy session. And I've had clients where I talk about that and I repeat that. And eventually I say, I'm not going to keep doing this. I think you're wasting time and money because you're just not doing anything to work on this. And so sometimes they stop, they cancel their sessions going forward. And while as a therapist, sometimes that's sad to me because I think, why can't you just work on this? I can't make them work on their issues. Now, the good news is I've had a handful of these clients, and after some time, maybe a year, maybe 6 months, they come back. And when I'm talking with them, they say, you were right. I was expecting you to fix this, and I wasn't doing anything to help it, to help myself or to help you help me. And they come back and they do good work and they engage and they start making the necessary changes. What I typically will say to partners is, let's give it a year. And I know a year sounds like a long time, but I'm also saying, look, you've been married for 32 years. So can we just give it one more year and see at the end of that year if your partner is engaging in some meaningful work that you're starting to see, however small it might be, you're starting to see the signs of something shifting, something changing. Now, we're not going to see everything change in a year, but we should start seeing some things start to change or shift. So how do you know if you're in a trauma bond? Some common signs that Dr. Carnes outlines are that you minimize or deny the harm being done. You feel addicted to the relationship and you're unable to leave even when you want to. There's a confusion between the intensity of the ups and the downs with real intimacy. Often you feel isolated and cut off from other people's perspectives. Other people just can't understand what you know. And you blame yourself for the harm that's happening, feeling like you can control it. If you can just change these few things, they will be different. And this is a real thing. You feel empty or worthless without the bond. Sometimes I work with people who, they can cut off the bond and they can walk away for a couple of weeks, for a month, and they report feeling empty, panic, loneliness without the bond, and they reach out. One thing as the therapist that I've learned is my judgment here about this dynamic is never helpful. We can talk about the trauma bond. We can talk about this dynamic that gets them to reach back out or go back to the relationship. But shame will never help them get out of it permanently. Awareness does. Time does. And being safe to talk about it honestly with somebody like a therapist can help so that eventually they don't go back. So how do you break free from a trauma bond? First, I think it's important to recognize it is hard. And that's not because you're weak. It's because your brain is literally wired into this cycle. Trauma bonds hook our survival system. It's not a relationship in which we're going to thrive or we're going to reach our full potential, but it hooks our survival system. So breaking these bonds takes time, it takes support, and it takes intention. And usually it takes compassion and empathy because we're not going to be successful the first time we try to break the bond. So I think there's some key steps. I think education around it. You have to be able to identify and name what is happening. And that starts to take some of the shame that the individual feels out of it. We can say, hey, there's a reason this happens. There's usually multiple phases of grieving, letting go of the illusion of what the relationship could be. For people who are caught up in a trauma bond, they've made it into this incredible relationship. If only, if they could just get here, right? Which is similar to somebody with a gambling addiction. My life is going to be dramatically improved when I just win this. And I'm so close. There has to be some boundaries, and these boundaries will make it feel like you can't bear it. Nevertheless, we have to have some separation. It's also really important that individuals have support. They have safe connections, non-judgmental connections outside of the trauma bond, whether that is friends or therapy or a therapy group. It's always harder to break these trauma bonds without some therapeutic work. And the therapeutic work, I think, has to be done with somebody who is trained in trauma-informed modalities and approaches the work with you from a trauma-informed perspective. And then the last thing I think that helps break the trauma bond is slowly, step by step over time, reclaiming self-worth, learning that your value doesn't depend on someone else or this other person really loving you or approving of you. Your self-worth is in you, and it's been there all along. Dr. Carnes talks about the shift from intensity to intimacy. And I think that's the heart of healing. Real intimacy is slow, steady, consistent, and safe. It doesn't leave you on the ground, flat on your back, with the football pulled away. And it doesn't demand that you betray yourself to stay connected. Any relationship that costs you who you are is too high of a price. Now, as I close, I want to bring back these images that Dr. Carnes gives us. Patty Hearst, aligning with her captors, blindfolded in a van, scared. These people broke into their apartment. I think they injured her boyfriend. He was down on the ground. He survived, but they hit him over the head or something. She's blindfolded. She's put in this van. I think they changed cars at one point. Imagine the terror that she must have been feeling. And then she feels the warmth of somebody's hand reaching out and holding hers. How safe that must have felt in that moment of terror, in those moments of terror. At the time, this was the case that led to the label of Stockholm Syndrome. Also reflect on that image of Charlie Brown running towards that football again. One of the men's groups I was facilitating, I think we had read a book. We were reading a book as part of group, and it talked about the impact of childhood trauma. We were looking at that. And I pulled up a clip from It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, where Lucy does this to Charlie Brown. And we watched it. And initially, some of the men were laughing. We've all seen this show. I mean, if you're my age or even millennials, I think we all watched this show in October coming up to Halloween. And initially they started laughing. And then it just got really silent. And it played through, and I turned it off and said, let's talk about what that was. And they did not like it. Initially, it was, oh yeah, that's that funny Charlie Brown. But then they were like, that doesn't feel good. I don't like that. Some of them wondered, this was a group for individuals recovering from sex addiction. Some of them wondered if they were Charlie Brown. Some of them identified as being Lucy, which was really painful. But as a group, we were able to talk about that. Hold space for whatever emotions were coming up. They were heavy. They were sad. They were painful. But in that group, we had built trust with each other. We had built safety with each other. They loved each other. And that's a great place to talk about some of these dynamics. That's a good space to be able to talk about some of these dynamics and allow people to open up and talk about what comes up for them. In these two examples, one is extreme. One is more playful, but they both show the same dynamic. When betrayal is tied to hope, the bond is stronger than logic. And breaking free isn't about blaming ourselves for being in this situation or even blaming the other person for their flaws. It's about recognizing the pattern, the dance of harm and repair that keep us stuck, and choosing little by little to step out of it. So if you are resonating with this podcast episode. First of all, that's painful, and I'm sorry. But I have a reflection question for you. Where in your life have you mistaken intensity for intimacy? And what would it look like to begin choosing safety instead? If this episode brought something up for you, I encourage you to reach out for support. Patrick Carnes' book, The Betrayal Bond, is an excellent resource. It's hard. It's a hard read. I often have who read it take some breaks in between chapters, especially the heavy ones. Maybe set it down for a couple of weeks and then pick it back up. Trauma-informed therapy can also help you begin loosening these ties. Thanks so much for being here with me today. If you haven't, please hit subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the bell so that you're notified of future content. It costs you nothing, but it is helpful for me. If you haven't already, please leave a review on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast. And if this episode brought somebody to mind who you think this could help, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.